Well, welcome everybody to our little satsang and study, and we're continuing on with I am that. This time we are on chapter 5, and if you notice my voice is a little bad, I apologize. I've had a cold, so I'm fine, but my voice doesn't seem to have recognized that fact yet, so it's doing what it's doing. Um, but let's go ahead and start. Um, the the really interesting thing about this, if you remember last time, the there was a point, the title was that the real world is beyond the mind. And so we kind of looked at everything from the real being beyond the mind. And today we get that a little bit reversed, because what happens now is that we focus back on what's in the mind, which is the world, if you will, the world as it arises. And the title of this one is "What is Born Must Die." So now we're staking out the fact that within duality, that all arises and falls, so it has a beginning and it has an end. And that's what the point of this time is. And there's a couple really interesting things that get introduced, and we'll do that. Now, what of course Nisargadatta does here is he starts with the uh, what's within duality, which is the I am. So we've talked about the I am and how the I am is part of consciousness. Remember that when Nisargadatta speaks of consciousness, unlike a lot of folks use consciousness and they include changeability, consciousness as changeability and consciousness at rest. Nisargadatta is always very careful. Whenever he says consciousness, he's talking about the active world, beginnings, endings, duality. When he wants to talk about consciousness at rest, which is the way some folks talk about it, he uses the term absolute awareness. So he separates them as though, in essence, they are just simply different things, even though, and that's one of the things whenever you're talking about something, you have no choice but to observe the boundaries of language and the lines that they create. But within the actual arising, what happens, and you'll see he talks about this. It all arises together. So there aren't any convenient boundary lines that you can go find and go, oh, here's where this begins and here's where this ends. It's not like that. It's all a one piece experience. So when we're playing around in, just remember that. So the the first question is the witness consciousness permanent or not? Right? And what Nisargadatta says is it's not permanent. The knower rises and sets with the known. Right? So he's talking about consciousness now. That in which both the knower and the known arise and set is beyond that in which both the knower and known arise and set is beyond time. The words permanent or eternal do not apply. So what he's talking about here is that within consciousness itself has arisen, it has begun, right? And consciousness itself will have a time where it itself, at least in the way that it is displayed here, will end. So if you remember in the Upanishads, there's a very famous quote about the spider spinning its web and pulling it back again. So the spider being absolute awareness, it can be absolute awareness without the display of manifestation. But once the display of manifestation has arisen, of course, that's the spider spinning its web, and it will pull that web back again. So that's all he's saying, is that where the known and the knower are together, they arise, right? They begin and they end, right? Now, um, the next one, of course, which is kind of interesting, because the questioner goes, well, wait a minute, in sleep. And people talk a lot about deep sleep and that kind of thing. And this is really one of the clearer pieces I've seen. He goes, In sleep, there is neither the known nor the knower. What keeps the body sensitive and receptive? And the Nisargadatta is pretty immediate. He says, surely you cannot say that the knower was absent. First thing he says, the experience of things and thoughts was not there. That is all. But the absence of experience too is experience. Right? So the absence of experience is experience. It's like entering a dark room and saying, I see nothing. Right? A man blind from birth knows not what darkness means. Similarly, only the knower knows that he does not know. Sleep is merely a lapse in memory. Life goes on. So whenever you see, I don't know why, but folks really like to get into these discussions about sleep and what sleep, what that state is and what it means and everything. I really like what he does here because he immediately packs the sleep experience into the awakening, that awake and sleep are parts of the same arising and falling experience, and those have their beginnings and their endings. And so that's what he's really after here. So anyway, um, he goes on through this, and he goes, what is this sense of separate existence? That's what the questioner asks. And he goes, it is a reflection in a separate body of the one reality. Right. So remember, we just talked about how this is actually a one piece exercise. So he's now he's linking those together. In this reflection, right, this is really a great point. The unlimited and the limited are confused and taken to be the same. To undo this confusion is the purpose of yoga. Now, I won't go into what yoga means. I mean, yoga in this sense is the entire philosophy of union, or pre-existent union. Do you remember what? I'm trying to think what his name was. There's a really I'll think of it in a minute. There's a really good phrase which kind of speaks to um, how all that is absolute awareness, and all that is existence prior. It's a prior unity, if you will. Now, notice whenever we talk, that's who I was after, was Adida and his term prior unity. And I was going to ask Michael what that was, and I couldn't remember Adida's name, which really makes it a difficult question. But if you think of it, think about how we as humans have to use language. So instead of actually being able to call something out in its completeness, as it were, in other words, prior, right? What we do is we say prior unity. So we have to use a word that basically defines itself by the putting of pieces together, right? We don't have a word for what does it look like before the pieces are put together, right? And I used to tell this story every now and then. I would go, when I was a child, my mother would tell me the story about Humpty Dumpty. I don't know if you know this story or not, but Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, and Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. And all the king's horses and all the king's men could never put Humpty together again. And so my mother would tell me that. And then I had a grandfather who used to tell me these amazing stories of wisdom and everything. And one day he said, Alan, he said, what if they'd been able to put Humpty Dumpty together? And I thought about that for a minute. And he said, then you'd see Humpty Dumpty sitting on the wall. He says, but would it be the same? And I said, well, Grandpa, I'm a child, of course, right? So it's pretty obvious to me that if you glue Humpty Dumpty together, before he fell, you had this beautiful Humpty Dumpty that was an egg, right? After he fell and you put him back together, right? You'd have this dude sitting up there and he'd have all these cracks. I said, but Grandpa, I said, he'd have all of those cracks. I said, it's not the same. And he goes, always remember that. He said humans always deal in second-hand stories. That was his, we only talk about things after the egg is broken, but never before. And that's what that when you start to hear these things, the unlimited and the limited are confused. right? We take one to be the other. And this is what gives us our sense of bondage, right? Because we see from a perspective of what we see, right? We see death happen and we assume that there's some ending. But there is no ending, right? We always were and we always will be. So how do you get those two things to make any sense? And that's why the unlimited and the limited are confused and taken to be the same. And so the whole point of starting to dissolve our notions, our concepts, because all of our concepts are built, if you think about it, to support the beginning and ending of who we think we are, right? And that's where the ego comes from, our persona story, all of the things, those are all built, but they're all built around who we are. And what's the biggest fear that we have? The fear that we don't exist, the fear of death, right? And yet we can't die. It's not possible. We can't be born either, not possible. But because everything we witness has a beginning and an end. And of course, I've got a physics and science teacher here. So if you think about it, you can even extend it out to the very beginning. It's not just sentient things that begin and end. Actually, it's everything. And in fact, we're not entirely sure that everything isn't sentient, to be very honest with you. But the reality is, as science works to identify the duality in which it exists, what it finds is that all that can be identified and all that can be seen begin and end, right? And that's the bondage that we find ourselves in, is the beginning and the ending. So
If I may,
please.
one of the things that is in my physics studies and in my teachings and so on, I took quite a few quantum physics courses, and my physics proved my metaphysics totally. I mean, I sat there in physics class and went, "Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
this makes sense,"
Makes sense.
And then got into quantum physics and realized that the whole idea of connectedness proved everything on this journey that I was on, and everything that I was being told at the time on that journey of the truth of the connectedness and it's like, well, even in science they're showing that now. Even in the science is finally catching up with, but it has been known for 100 years, and people are still not. I mean, even Einstein himself said, that the gods don't play around with
Yeah,
things, and
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's like there's still that doubt.
Well,
Still, after even science has shown, there's still that doubt.
it's fascinating because the first time I ran into quantum, um, the thing that struck me was that there were no causes, right? There's no cause, right?
No.
And of course, the only place that I had heard that, there's only one other place that you would hear that, and that's in this kind of thing. And what surprised me was that when you would see folks discuss the uh, pointer, if you will, of no causes, right? And it was that pointer, incredible resistance, right? But when someone,
Absolutely.
right, but when somebody would teach the quantum, right, they would just sit there and go, well, this is above my head. And it always made me laugh that they would argue about causation when it was in the context of personal awakening, or let's call this a spirituality conversation. But but when it was a science conversation, if they didn't understand it, well, it was above my head. It's okay. In other words, it's okay if that's the case. I don't understand it, but that's okay. And I just really found
Yeah,
I just made me chuckle that people would take, because of the same exact. I mean, think about it. Causation is causation. So it doesn't really matter whether it's a scientific conversation or a
I did.
spiritual
I did.
conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I did ask my physics teacher one time if I could bring a baseball glove to class, to catch all of those things that were flying over my head. Yeah.
I like that one. I like that one. Okay. So, well, let's just wander a little further. Um, so so in this, what's interesting is that, and actually Nisargadatta will do more of this later, but the question comes up, but does one get reborn? And the response to that's really interesting. He goes, what was born must die. That's the chapter. He said, only the unborn is deathless. Then he says, find what it is that never sleeps, never wakes, and whose pale reflection is our sense of I. Right. So what he's saying here is that the I am, if you will, is a pale reflection of absolute awareness itself. That's what he's after. And so in the beginning, he will always send folks his method, not method, I don't want to call it that, but his pointer is to sit on the I am, be with the I am always. But the I am itself at a certain point dissolves, collapses, and in that collapse, there is what's underneath the sense of I is absolute awareness itself, right? So here's where what I find really interesting is that um, the questioner then says, well, wait a minute, how do I do that? That's what this questioner is now interested in. And here's the first time you're going to run into this, but he uses a terminology that I find really fascinating, and you hear it throughout his teaching. And he said, do you mean to say that the mere wanting to find out is enough? He said, surely both qualifications and opportunities are needed. Now, remember what's happening here. A questioner is always going to approach it and say, what do I, as a finite being or the identified person I think I am, need to do in order to find what it is we're up to finding? That's always going to be the question. And so whenever that question comes in, then the step over needs to be, how do you take it from the question out of a dual framing, right? And then place it in the context of absolute awareness. That's the step over. And here's his answer. This will come with earnestness, right? That's the first time you're going to hear that. And you're going to hear earnestness from him. That's one of his favorite drivers when he talks about what we as a seeker, what's in there. And it's an interesting conversation. He says, what is supremely important is to be free from contradictions, right? Well, where do contradictions exist? Only one place. Where separation exists, duality. He said the goal and the way must not be on different levels. Again, out of duality. Life and light must not quarrel. Behavior must not betray belief. Call it honesty, integrity, wholeness. You must not go back, undo, uproot, and abandon the conquered ground. And then he uses this. Then there's another word that comes in here, right? It goes with earnestness. Tenacity of purpose and honesty in pursuit will bring you to your goal. Now, that almost sounds like he is suggesting, right, that you become earnest and tenacious. And yet, what he's actually saying is that when you look at a seeker, that the earnestness and the tenacity arise naturally in the seeker. That's something he has just been able to see along the way. Right. So how do you say that? And because the person says tenacity and honesty are endowments, surely, right? And not a trace of them I have. So this is the individual saying, well, wait a minute, those must be attributes of the personality, right? And he said, all will come as you go on. because there's not a way to step out of that question and into an answer that makes much sense. He says, take the first step first. All blessings come from within. Turn within. I am, you know, be with it all the time you can spare until you revert to it spontaneously. There is no simpler and easier way. So the best he can offer up here, right? He can't take someone all the way into the absolute, right? So so what he does is say, in terms of your own journey, go be with the I am, because until that dissolution begins, anything that I tell you is outside any frame of reference that would help you from a pointing standpoint, right? So for everyone who's in their journey, it's just a matter of taking a look at where I am. This is what actually is a beautiful thing. It brings the beginners and the beginners and those those who have been more seasoned, let's say, into the same conversation, because one collapses into the other. And so there's always that place where you can say, just be with the I am, right? And it's really this seems like something that wouldn't come up. Back in 2013, I wrote a book called Awakened Leadership. I spent a lot of years in the corporate world doing leadership development and personal development. Of course, what I wanted to do was migrate, this particular explosion that had happened in my own life into that world. Now that's a challenge. I want you to understand that non-duality in the corporate world. I used to say that it was an intersection, and if you stood in it, you never needed to worry about getting run over, because because those two things, from what I could tell, didn't meet very often. But I wrote this book, and I knew a fellow who was one of the really highly respected leadership people, and so I sent him the book so he could review it, and he was going to write a blurb for me, and that was going to be a really nice thing. And he called me and he said, Alan, he said, I can't write this blurb for you. And I said, wow, why? He said, well, he said, there's a point, he said, which I believe is a really important point. And he says, we just don't connect on that particular point. He said, the way you explain it, he said, awakening is not an attribute of the individual. And he said, to me, that it's obvious it could be nothing else. And he said, were it not for the fact that you have migrated the essence of all awakening, that the ending of our leadership journey, if you will, the developmental journey internally, includes that there is no individual and no attributes of any individual. He said that's a place beyond that I could go. And I just always found it interesting, because that is a pretty, that's an interesting point, but he had spotted it and puzzled over it and really couldn't come to a place that he was okay with that. And in the book, I had gone there, and I don't know of anybody else who's ever taken the developmental work and actually pushed it all the way. Certainly not and printed it and passed it out in the corporate world, but nonetheless, interestingly enough, it does come up, and people are very sensitive to making sure that that the egos that they know and how they describe it and the work that we're doing in the world never leaks, if you will, and never leaks out into that place where, what there is there's an absolute awareness, and there is that the individual is seeing that the developmental work itself is going to leave behind the developed product.
And that's what I was asking when we had gotten together last Thursday, was the moving from the identification as this to then be with identifying with it And then even moving beyond the with it, you know, leaving that behind.
Yeah. Yeah. And
It's
that's
hard to do, but
it,
once it's done, then it's like, well, wow, I got to get used to this because this is really strange. I don't identify as this, and I'm not identifying with it. When I didn't identify as it, I kept saying, okay, I keep calling this my body, my mind, my this, my that. But how can I own it and be it? That didn't make sense to me at all. And so, but getting used to not identifying as it, not identifying even with it, you know,
well, it's really funny
that's
because
hard.
achievers, right? And I've lived my life in a world of achievers, as you can, or so that's how they see themselves, certainly. Uh,
Certainly.
and so what's always fascinating is how often someone who's on this, who's on their spiritual journey will get to a point. I know Michael's seen this a lot too, and all of a sudden they are in a self-described state of malaise,
Right.
right? And what that has everything to do with is the notion that is created when somebody thinks of I'm not my body, I'm not identified with my body, I'm not identified with the doer, right? So when the concept that occurs, or the concepts that seemingly is obvious to a lot of folks, is that if that happens, there's nothing left to drive, if you will, the arising of the body, all of its habits, all of its behaviors, all of that. There's nothing left to do that because that's shifted to somewhere else. And here I sit in a state of inactivity, not wanting to do anything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And you see that, at least I would see it a lot, particularly with highly, people that were highly motivated to basically achieve. That was the world that they lived in, and it was very difficult to get out of that notion. Were you going to say something, Michael?
I just had a question. I was going to go back to the text and
Yeah,
something
cool. Cool.
Dada said. So the question was, what is the sense of a separate existence? And Nisargadatta says it is a reflection in a separate body of the one reality. So
Mm-hmm.
I can experience that. But then he says this reflection, in this reflection, the unlimited and the limited are confused and taken to be the same. What do you think, what does he mean by unlimited there? Because if unlimited means absolute, then I don't agree with what he's saying. If unlimited is merely the opposite of limited, and compared to the experience of where there is no opposite, then I can agree with this.
No, the way I took it, and I may not be at my sharpest today, so excuse me for that one. But um, the way I took it was that in this reflection, the unlimited and limited, in essence, both are there, if you will, if you want to use it in that terminology. And yet, what we do is we define it all as limited. That would be how that was what I was taking that the example that we use often, where the I that I am, if you look at it as a piece of art, covers the entire canvas. So we don't see the canvas. All we see is the art, the differences and boundaries and the rest of it. But the canvas is definitely there, right? So the way I read it was that they're confused and taken to be the same. So when he says they're taken to be the same, I'm really sure that, from what I've been able to tell in the confusion of being human, that we don't take it to be unlimited. We don't lean to the unlimited. When we take it to be the same, the same means we lean to the limited. We think it's all limited, right? So That was how I read the comment, or how I understood the comment.
Yeah, Manish texted me. I took the unlimited to be what Nisargadatta Maharaj called the ray of the absolute that is in us. Um, well, if it's the ray of the absolute that's in us, then um, how would the unlimited or the absolute and the limited be different? Because my experience is that there is the, I call it the source, but it could be the absolute,
Sure.
and it is not separate from the limited. It is kind of infusing and living the limited, even though the limited is still there.
Absolutely. And so that's how I would see it.
Well, why does he say that that is different, that the limited and unlimited are different? If in fact, like my experience is that they're not. If
Well,
the unlimited means the ray of absolute that is in us and as us.
that's the unlimited, right? The unlimited is the ray of the absolute, right?
Yeah.
And within that absolute arises
Mm,
or display manifestation or duality. That's
mm,
how I would say it, you know. And so when I, as I said, when I read this, what I'm reading what I'm reading is he's trying to unpack uh, the fact that they both exist, they come together, right? And yet one is obscured. So how do you describe that? That's what I think he's after here. That's what I would think. Um, and so to me, which is basically the whole conundrum, right? In other words, our bondage is a function of the fact that we don't see there's no experience of the unlimited by the obscuring of that unlimited by taking one to be the other, right? But that they're both always there. So when he says they are confused, right? The confusion is that entire piece is taken to be one thing only, right? And you and I both know that that one thing doesn't exist by itself, right? I always say it arises within. That's the best language I can find to try to delineate the fact that both are always present, as it were. That's how I would go after it. And the one thing you have to remember with Nisargadatta, in my mind, even though yes, I know that Fryman was a great translator. Um, the the one thing that I continuously find is that translators and experience don't necessarily mesh very well. So when I run into these, I usually what I'll do is I'll go to well, what would be what would you want to teach if you were trying to say something like that?
mm,
Because I'm going to guess in Marathi it came out a lot different than it does in this translated English.
mm.
But that's just something to know. So I think your point's well taken. When I look at the language now that I've heard, now we've talked about it for a minute, I can see where you arrive at, oh, wait a minute, this can't be. So to me, I take that as a linguistic problem, not a, I don't think Nisargadatta would have, you know, tried to niggle that piece out. I don't think that's part of what would be there.
Manish, do you have anything to say? I'm interested because you wrote you wrote the note to me. How did you interpret that?
I was actually watching that clips from that documentary, The Ray of the Absolute. So I
Ah,
was listening to one of his translators describe, um, um, and then there were certain, recordings from his talks, and the translator was translating them. And then he said, when he's saying here is the confusion, he's like, we think that we are our mind, our body, but when we get into the state of watching our thoughts, then we are able to connect with that
You'll never pay for
which
Netflix
was
again
never
after seeing
born and which will never die.
yeah,
And until we get to that state, we keep thinking that we are separate. We were born, we will die.
yeah. Actually, that was a very concise summary of the whole chapter. Thank you. It really was. And what was so to me, what was interesting, you saw at the end how it seems to me that he saw that the questioner didn't have the experience to untangle what you just explained. And so rather than try to untangle that for him and leave him in this kind of conceptual world where he was sorting out concepts, he told him to go sit on the I am, because then the experience of sitting on the I am would over time yield, right, the other piece. So the way he's working with this, and that was what I found interesting. The way he's working with this was exactly that. And even with the earnestness and tenacity piece, right? I mean, I have yet to meet anyone who has worked with this material for a long period of time that can't look at themselves and recognize, that they've kind of jumped into this thing, and this has become a central, if not the central piece of what's going on in their world, right? That just seems to be what happens over time. And so people sometimes they'll say to me, "Hey, wait a minute, I don't have any tenacity. I'm not an earnestness and tenacity person." And I'll say, "Well, has this become the main thing in your life?" It has. That's tenacity and earnestness. If something like this moves into the main focus of your life, tenacity and earnestness are being expressed through you, right? That there's nothing much else you could say other than that's what's happening in that particular instance. Yeah. So you'll hear him. He talks about that a lot, but remember, that is just an observation of what it looks like, right? It's not an attribute of most individuals would describe the other individuals they see that within, right, as being an attribute of the person they see, because that's how we describe things, right? When you put the egg back together, you're going to see all the cracks. Those are the attributes. So the only way you can describe a broken egg is in its brokenness, right? But to describe the egg as unbroken, as it were, then that's when it's just an observation. That's just how that is. There isn't any individual left. The recognition is that that's an extracted story that can't even, there is no me, no extraction, no level of hours and hours of extraction will lead to a biography or definition of this thing called me. Ultimately, all that is a fiction, if you will, right? It's a fiction. It's a story that's used as if, right? So the ego identified believes it is that it is that constructed thing. It is that definition. The unidentified ego recognizes that in order to live in the world, that when somebody says, hey you, that the response is what? If someone says, hey you, the response is what? So there is an ego there, right? And so but it's not an identified ego. And I always call that the state of as if, right? No matter what, the recognition of the non-identification with the ego doesn't eliminate living life day to day. So someone is likely to say, hey, you, along the way here, and there's going to be a response, which is, what do you need? And so those are ego interactions, if you will, and just ego interactions between two pieces as if they existed, the state of as if. That's what when you try to describe it, right? Because you're trying to describe something that people for thousands and thousands of years have told stories about, so we're very identified with how we describe things, right? And the stories and how they play. So the as if just gives you a way of describing the same interactions, just whether or not they're identified. That's what I use. That's what I use.
I heard someone say one time that before awakening, chop wood, carry water. after awakening, chop wood, carry water. I mean, you know, until this is done, however long that takes, it just continues on its,
Yeah. 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 Ramesh used to say, he says, in the morning, if you open your eyes and everything's there, you're still in the game.
Yep. Yeah.
So like, okay, that's, sure. I guess that's how it is, and then he something that, and if you've caught him on a good day, he'd kind of chuckle and go, but man, I'm tired. It's to make me laugh. Man, I'm tired. Anyway. Oh, well, great. Any questions, guys? That I think kind of covers it for today. It was I really I just enjoy the build, like I say, no, this something just to notice as we go through these pieces, that there was some attention paid to how this is built. And so I enjoy that. And if you notice that as you're going along, make sure you bring it in, because I may not have. So, and I just really enjoy there is an elegance, I think, to how this particular piece was put together. The I am that, and I just, when I see those pieces, I just enjoy that. Any questions?
I have one more annoying question.
Oh yeah, annoy me. It's not like you haven't before.
Yeah. So we talk about you talk a lot about identification,
Yeah,
and it's identification with a personal ego.
yeah.
And kind of the teaching is to move beyond the personal identification with those stories and to sit in the I am. I hear that a lot, sit in the I am.
Mm.
And there are kind of two experiences of the I am that I've gone through, over just kind of years of seeking. One part of the I am is or one experience of the I am is a concept, and it's kind of like the emptiest concept that you could possibly get to, because you just get rest on the concept of I am, and all of the other concepts that described that baseline story are no longer applicable to who you are. And then kind of the next layer out is what Manish was talking about, where the I am is actually able to observe the story of I am. And so I am actually literally moves beyond the personal into something that is outside of the personal. And, that sort of witnessing, I mean, you can actually you can sit in the witness and merely sit in the I am without the witnessing happening. And you can also personally identify with the witness. So we're kind of moving one identification with all of concepts to an identification with the I am. Is that what Nisargadatta is? Like when someone says rest in the I am, is he looking to remove you from the um, attachment to the concept I am, or just the bulk of concepts in general, to re-identify you with I am? And he doesn't always call I am witnessing. Sometimes they feel like they're two different things,
Yeah,
because Ramana Maharshi called the witness the I. It's kind of the
correct,
Right.
I of the I,
correct,
and then
correct.
which for me is more accurate than the I am,
Yep.
because the I am feels like more like the empty concept, or it's not empty, it's like it's just one particular concept that has kind of refuted all other concepts that described it. Um, so we've kind of moved from being identified with all the stories to identified with an I am. And I'm not sure what Nisargadatta means by that I am, because, like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean the witness. So what is that? Is he describing, is there is it kind of like the empty witness, just the being of the witness? And
Well,
then when after you get after that, um, the witness, there's actually the witness generally looks forward, so it sees the objects, it sees the concepts arising, it sees stories arising, feelings, thoughts, emotions, the external world. And it seems like the witness is looking one way. But what I found is the witness can actually be turned around and looked at the space behind it. And so the witness is a contraction that's actually resting in. And for me, that space is source. And the way Ramesh talks about the source is it's possible to have to actually rest in what he calls a perception. So that sounds like a kind of like a transpersonal attachment. And so is apperception a um, still kind of a transpersonal contraction, and the absolute is still beyond that apperception? So that's kind of a big, broad, huge
That's a
question.
big question. Yeah, we could spend
Yeah.
the next, couple days on this one. Um,
I
well,
think that's what I was trying to allude to when I was saying the
yeah, yeah,
identification as Diane
yeah,
moved to identification with it,
Hmm.
moved to no longer identifying.
Hmm.
right. And
You
I
know, I
think the looking back, I mean, Ramesh was the one who would talk about the Tibetan meditation where one would, it's the same thing. I use it every now and then, where you basically perceive everything in front of you, right? And then you actually do this physically. You see, now physically step back and include yourself in that observing, right?
Hmm.
Now, if one wanted to turn it around, in other words, that just becomes a visual, if you will. I mean, it's the action is from behind, and that observing, I have always taken to be exactly the same as you take it, which is the absolute. That's that observing from behind is the natural apperception. That would be
See, that's, I guess that's one place where like I'm trying to push that interpretation, if you will, because for me, like there's an experience where everything you identified as like a transpersonal witness, everything is inside of you, right? So even the external world is inside of that witness. Your body is inside of that witness. And so you have pushed the witness back, but it's still looking forward, if you will. And so there's something behind the witness, and for me, that's where we get into source and absolute. That's actually living the witness, and that's where the apperception comes from. Like because for me, the witness is still a perceiver. It's not apperception. It's still the perceiver
okay.
of objects and kind of the
Yeah,
basic
yeah.
environment.
Because the kind of the where it's looking and from where it's looking, as I said, to me, the Tibetan piece was just simply to use how one would normally experience it and move into that space.
Mhm.
Once in
but
that
that space
space,
isn't an experience anymore. There's no experience to it.
well, it's experience with no experiencer, let's say.
Right. Let's say, okay.
Yeah, it's just
There's
it's
no longer, it's just experiencing happening.
yeah. So which is what apperception is, right? Perceiving with no perceiver.
Mhm.
So the experience here is that once stepped back, that there's no longer a forward and backward or any orientation
Mhm.
as to location, space, or direction. That
Mhm.
that 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 in that meditation, if you will, that it's intended to create a device, which is the ultimate meditation, or the mimicry of awakening. I think is what that's what that's intended to
Mhm.
do. That's certainly what Ramesh would have said. And so my experience was that there is no directional location unless there's a visual, right? Usually it's a visual that gives one that information. So
Mhm.
so the visual itself is in essence eliminated. I think when the visuals are eliminated, that might be the crossover from the transpersonal witness to absolute awareness. I'm going to guess, right? In other words, that's where I say that the line ends up, being crossed, as it were, if you want to use that kind of thing. Now, if you want to go back, go ahead.
Would that be how Ramana Maharshi used the "Who am I"? Because he would always say, who are you? And a person would start, well, I'm this and this. And
Right.
those are concepts.
Right.
With behind those, who
Right.
are you? And
Yeah.
keep going behind until there are no more concepts
Yeah.
that can be,
Right.
and
so
it's
the idea was that the answer itself at one point in time, that the explanations of who one is in conceptual form are jettisoned, and one simply falls into, I guess you could say, one falls into what is. So that's what that inquiry is intended to deliver. So, that's that version of it. So when in the beginning of your piece, you were asking about identification. So from a felt experience standpoint, just to get the first two steps nailed down, the first step is the doing that we all learn how to do, where what is felt is completely limited in terms of how it's held to the body, mind, the individual, and the ego. That's the only story that is, right? So what starts to happen is that feeling of I exist, right, gets interpreted to be I exist as a separate autonomous doer.
Mhm.
Right? That's what that is. And so what happens at the I am is that the watching, the witness at the I am level becomes the expansion of that notion of I exist. So when he says sit on the I am, what I take that to be is that the expansion begins and the witness inevitably arises, because when one sits on the I am, it becomes seen that I am is just not simply the interpretation of me only, right? In other words, and so that's where it starts, right? And then we move into the piece of conversation that we just had. But I just wanted to go after that because for me it's a felt experience, right? It's you exist, and the rest is interpretation. The problem is the interpretation that binds that sense of existence, the sense that I exist, to something much more limited than it is. So that's the starting point, is exactly at that particular starting point. That's how I would attack that. So
I think Irena had a question. I saw her hand up.
is that true? Did you put your hand up?
I did, but then I changed my mind. I guess since you called me out, Michael, I'll ask it. It was kind of a question. It's not even sure how important it is for me. It was just something that kind of popped up as I was reading this section about the absence of experience to being an experience, where they're talking about sleep and says the experience of things and thoughts was not there. That is all, but the absence of experience too is experience. And then later on it says sleep is merely a lapse in memory. I came in a little bit later, so I apologize if maybe you've touched on this, but my question is this something that is verifiable for you? I mean, I can take him for his word, but I'm not sure that that's verifiable for me. If I'm
Did everybody freeze? Oh, wow. There we go.
There you go.
Sorry, you said, is it verifiable? And the screen froze, the entire screen.
okay.
I said, damn, that must be an important question.
Yeah, my question, I guess, is I'm curious if it's verifiable for you. I can take him for his word, but I'm not sure that that is something that is verifiable in my, because I can only come to that conclusion from my waking experience in regards to deep sleep. But I can't report from a place of deep sleep this absence or presence of experience.
Well, the example that I have always heard, and I think it becomes, it's verifiable from a standpoint of just simple personal inquiry, because there's no other way. I mean, I don't think there's any other way to really to deal with that. But you know, you hear all of the masters, they would always say, you know, when you wake up, you say, oh, you know, I had a great sleep. So there's a sense. In other words, what they're trying to point out is that the experience of deep sleep or sleep is an experience. It's just not one that includes all of the arising of all the detail of manifestation, but rather the absence of that arising. But in the absence of that arising, that there still is a sense of you there, so to speak. In other words, there's still a witnessing of whatever that is, even though it's an absence of of all that we normally would say is identifiable or knowable. If that, I don't know if that helps. I don't know if that helps or not, but that's about the best I think you're going to get on that one. You know, I have to tell you that it that one still is kind of an interesting one to me when people start talking about sleep and deep sleep and all. I mean, I don't know if there's an area where I find that you can go down the rabbit hole quicker than when you start to talk about states, and particularly sleep and deep sleep, because it's always like, okay.
Yeah, well,
um,
this is the difference. Like, you know, Advaita tends to be more of an intellectual
yeah,
path where one uses the mind to pierce the mind. But in more meditative paths, like I go to, like, I can't get into the lotus position because my legs just don't work that way. So I go to sensory deprivation tanks twice a week. And the kind of the kind of most profound experience that I have in there every single time is that both my mind and my body drop. They literally, I don't know they're there because my body is so relaxed, and then the mind falls, and the experience is just being in a big open black space with awareness still there. And it feels like sleep, but yet the awareness is still there. And so I think that what they're talking about can be meditatively experienced if one kind of practices and uses that, you know, uses that path to locate it. It just, you know, Advaita doesn't seem to be, you know, and that doesn't seem to be part of the path and maybe I'm wrong about that.
well,
I think Advaita is, you know, there are the 8 limbs of yoga or whatever. The Jnana yoga is the mind, using the mind.
Yeah.
Very you know, very, not meditative, but very intellectual, very intellectual. And that's Advaita, I would say, is an intellectual, you know, discussing, looking into, doing. Whereas other limbs of yoga, you know, there's the bhakti where you are just, I mean, they're all different paths to get you to the same place.
No
And
doubt about that. Yeah. And well, I think what's fascinating too to me is that I think it has a lot to do with, you know, if you watch certain groupings get together, then the feeling of the teaching ends up reflecting that grouping. So I remember when the first time I saw Ramesh, and of course I had been with Osho for how many years, so you can imagine. And one of his first things he ever said, he said, just what Advaita needs is a tantrika, you know, we need lots of those, you know. So So I have always found that because of, and Michael and I have talked about this, that, my sense of things, if you will, is that you're going to get some combinations, right, of these different paths, but that the pure Advaita pieces, or folks, there's not a lot of color in that world, right? And that's just because of the way it's held and discussed, and that you see that a lot. And yet, um, I'm by nature, this body mind is a squeeze life like a lemon, right? That's in there, right? There's just no, like if you go somewhere with me, we will be hunting street food down, and because I just, there's that, so when Michael asks questions sometimes, or when we're working with these questions, I'm always trying to go to the experience, right? And say, okay, how does it feel experientially? So in other words, I know I exist. What's that feel like? And then extend that to the words, right? Or so when somebody says to me, perceiving without a perceiver, right? That for most folks, that's a concept. For me, I started perceiving, right? That's a visceral activity. There's some, perceiving is a happening, right? So it's always trying to tie these two things together. And I think that's a real challenge. And I think Irana's question really centers there, if you will, because when she asks it, right, I want to go into that place where, okay, it's deep sleep, right? What the sense of deep sleep, what's that? All right. And now can we extend it to something that we say that points to it? Right. And that one, I have to tell you, has been over the years a tough one. I haven't been as adroit linguistically in tying that one together. I have a sense that it does, right? That it is something that we can get to, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Like I say, if we arrive there and you guys are around, I'll get all excited and we can talk about it. But I haven't gotten that one yet. But I think, like I say, when we talked about the I am and that sense of the I am as a real limp, I am Alan. This is who I am, and then there's that movement into oh, Alan arises, right? That move is experiential. And now the question is, can we have a conversation where we describe it in such a way that we link it to that experience? And I think that's what Nisargadatta is after, because when you watch him in action, if you watch him, well, you've been watching, Manish has been watching some of there's clips of him. This was a man who chain smoked beaties, right?
Yeah.
This man lived, right? Anybody who's ever lived, you just take a look at this human being, and you're going, no, this guy was out there. He was walking the way. He was out there. He was grasping life, and so my sense of things is that this world of Advaita, when I read I am that, I'm always looking for the sense of the feel, right? What's it feel like? What's he talking about? And then I want to get to what he's saying, right, from that place of that feeling, or that sense of things, if you will. So I think I think that's where, if you watch, you'll see a lot of Advaitins get to the place and they'll write some book and they'll say, well, I've decided that awakening's not possible, but what is possible is this kind of screwed up life, and I'm going to try to sort it out for you, right? Because it seems like Advaitins never get anywhere when what they're engaged in is parsing concepts. That one doesn't get them anywhere, right? Well, I would say it's not connected to the entire sense of what is, right? What the experience is, what does it feel like when the feet are on the ground, right? What's that? And so that connection, when I see that it doesn't get made, you end up with a lot of folks that have been in non-duality, and now they're going to argue about consciousness and awareness and terms and this and that and the other, right? And that's where you see, I mean, when we started this group, that was my I would see these people on these threads and the Advaita groups and non-dual groups, and they were just beating the hell out of each other, right? And I was like, well, wait a minute, there's just a simple human caring, right? That's there, and that's how this happens. Otherwise, the possibility, it just seems to me the possibility is not there. And that's how I see it. But certainly there's a lot of color. I don't know if you call UG Krishnamurti an Advaitin or not, but I used to go a lot when I would see him. I used to, it's like I never knew what he was going to say, and when he said it, I had no idea what he was talking about. But man, he was really there. So it was great. I loved it. He was just that, completely unhinged,
But
and
that's because they have the same message, but it's coming through a whole different character.
that's the deal. That's exactly it. And
Yeah.
so there's a sense to the arising. Like I say, when you would sit with Ramesh, I mean, it was just Ramesh was way different than Nisargadatta. And so all of these, go see Robert Adams, whoever you want. I mean, I definitely was connected to no doubt Ramesh and Osho were the two that, but I went to see a bunch of the others just because it was interesting, and the reading of all of the others, because you could then see how the personalities, and ended up living within this Advaitic space, if you will, their version of what it is to unwind the mind with the mind. What does that look like? But I enjoyed the ones where there was a sense of something going on. Whenever it became so intellectual that there was no sense of anything going on, then that's when I have a tendency to kind of go, okay, I get why it gets branded as kind of a boring space. Yeah. Yeah, same for Eckhart Tolle. I saw that. Thank you. I need to post. I need to get that email. I told you last time. There is a story of when Eckhart Tolle meets Ramesh, and I think Ramesh kind of takes on a very Nisargadatta like. When you read this, it's a great one, and I will get that email, and I'll get that, and we'll post that. See if you, because it's really a great. It feeds right into what I'm talking about. You guys, you'll enjoy it. It's a great story. Yeah, happened some years back. I think Eckhart Tolle got 4 or 5 words in the whole. It was, which is very Nisargadatta like. Anyway. All right, enough for today.